Okay, so with Lesson 4, we're going to start discussing literary themes. We've got really good foundations, I think, established in the first 3 lessons, beginning with the relationship of literature and reality, and seeing that they really overlap to a great extent, and then looking at the 2 oldest genres of literature and poetry and mythology, the epic folded in there as well. Today we're going to be talking about 2 epics, but I feel at this point with those foundations established we can move more into the nitty-gritty, more in depth, start to talk about themes. Other genres such as drama and fiction will approach later on. During this time, now we're moving chronologically. We're looking at the mythology. We did Rome before Greece, but after this lesson we'll be moving forward chronological order. So at this time, the height of mythology with the epics, drama was also popular, as we talked about with Sophocles' plays Oedipus and Antigone. We can only do so much in one semester, though, and I chose to have us look at Shakespeare. So we'll know that drama is popular at this time too, but we'll get to our discussion of drama later on. And for the time being, we're going to look at some themes. The reason for looking at literary themes is that these are oftentimes the driving force of a text. A theme is an idea, a concept, a cultural movement, if you will, that oftentimes drives the text, can be what it's about. So question is then, for a class like this, what are some of the most important, essential key underlying themes? One I've chosen to focus in on for this class is the power of fear. The next lesson will address fear more directly. This lesson, my goal is to look at 4 or 5 different themes here that are all really crucial in the study of literature in general, and specifically indicate why fear is so important. Some of you might be wondering, why did he choose fear for the class? So hopefully that'll be clear through talking about these. The reading I had you do is a collection of articles, one on each of these themes, from a website called Litrical, which is a good source for just kind of basic information about a topic. It's a website run by a community college. I wouldn't necessarily cite it in papers because I don't know the extent of their peer review process, but the fact that it is published by a university means it's vetted enough. We can use it in a class like this, slightly a step up from Wikipedia and dealing more directly with literature. The crux of this discussion, though, is going to center around community versus individual. The article has it grouped as individual versus society. Community and society are very similar, but it works out that way in that you get a whole article on community, and then you get an article on individual versus community or society. So you really get in-depth look at community. Community is an important theme because every literary text with a strong narrative presents some type of community. I guess could have an individual living entirely by themselves, but there'd probably be something going on with how that individual relates to society. Even if he's not a part of society or she's not a part of society, they're probably living on the periphery of society, so to speak, or they're an outcast if it focuses solely on them. So I guess it's kind of a binary construction whether you're part of a community or not, and we'll look at how literature plays with those binaries. But essentially you can't escape community is what I'm saying. It's inevitable. So when you see a community in a literary work, some questions to ask are, how is that community put together? How does it function? What are the rules or laws that govern that community? Who are its leaders? What are their values and ideals, etc.? To begin to get an understanding of what the author's talking about. This plays into the idea of setting, right? Setting isn't just the physical description of a place, but it's also what that place is like. The physical description can tell you important things, though, such as, is the community isolated, etc. So looking at how the community, that's the main focus of a text, functions is very important. For today's literary text, we'll be talking about the Greek community. The Trojans play a significant role in the Iliad, but the passages I've chosen focus on the Greeks in the Greeks are the main focus of the text, even though there is a significant amount devoted to churches. And then obviously the Indian community and the Ramayana, from the name of a city I can't pronounce unless the pronunciation key is on the screen, so we'll name that in a minute. So those will be the two communities we focus on. So when you're reading a text, dive in, look at what is the community, what is the main focus here. Is it a small, insulated community like a village? Is it a big city? Is it set in New York? If it is a big city, is there smaller communities within that, a specific group or type of people that this text is about? Once you have that in mind, you can start to look at individuals in relation to the community. So if you have a community in a text and you've identified that, maybe it's some kind of small town, maybe it's a group within a larger community. For instance, if we use The Great Gatsby as an example, because that's a text you've probably all read before in high school or somewhere, but you probably enjoyed it a little bit more than some of the others, and there's been the recent film. You have several different communities, because you have the East Egg and West Egg, the two sides of the rural, not really rural, but it's in the countryside community, with the well-off people and the not as well-off, and Gatsby's trying to break into that upper echelon. He doesn't really belong to a community. He's on the outside. And then you have the working class community you go past as you enter the city, and so sometimes you have communities coming into conflict. Another good example would be Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, which you may have also read in high school, probably didn't enjoy as much as Gatsby. I do enjoy it, but you clearly have a Puritan community there, and Hester is clearly on the outside of that community, on the periphery, but the text is all about how the community functions. So once you've identified a community, then identify the individuals. Who are the protagonists, the antagonists, and what is their relationship to that community? Are they the leader of the community? Are they a crucial part of it? Are they on the outside of it? You see a number of different examples, an array in the Scarlet Letter, right? Because Hester is basically exiled from the community, although she still technically lives there. She's not a part of the community. Dimmesdale the Reverend is deeply enmeshed in the community, and because his secret goes against its values, that's what's giving him the problem. So you can see the individual and the society there, the conflict. And then Chillingsworth is not really a part of the community. He's just arrived, but he hasn't done anything to exclude himself, so he's becoming part of it, you could say. Same with Gatsby. He's on the outs of a community he wants to belong to, and he comes from, not literally from, but he comes from the type of community that more well-off community is specifically juxtaposed with. So what are the different relationships? What is the author trying to say? In the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne's clearly trying to say something about problems with the way that community functions and how it treats Hester. Same thing in Gatsby. Fitzgerald's calling into question, should anyone really want to belong to this community, since Gatsby's quest is overly idealistic and he's romanticized it in pursuing it is ultimately detrimental to him. So authors are able to make statements about communities by showing the individual's relationship to the community, and seeing how that functions can tell us a lot about what the author is trying to communicate. Nationalism comes into play here because you have communities and they have ideas and values and morals and beliefs and ideals. And sometimes those are agreed on as a consensus by the members of the community. Sometimes it's just implied. So the way those ideas and values are expressed can sometimes take the form of nationalism. What does nationalism really mean? The article does a good job of explaining it, I think. It's basically supporting one's country or one's community, a belief in it. And so you end up with these nationalistic narratives. Narratives that reflect the nation and the national identity. The U.S., for not having been a country very long, has a very specific identity. A real kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. If you look at the Statue of Liberty, the belief is because of the democracy here, and this goes back to the Revolution and why the settlers left England and fought the Revolutionary War, but the belief is that because of this type of democracy that clashed with what came before, anyone can accomplish anything here. And that's, whether that's true or not, that's a matter of debate and that's subjective, but that's the national narrative. And so our media tends to glorify literary works that reflect that narrative. I mentioned the idea of Kurt Warner before as this athlete with this big family who, worked his way up from not being drafted to winning Super Bowl MVP and bringing the Cardinals, back from the brink of despair. So, that narrative, compelling as it is glorified because it reflects kind of the national belief, American values. So you get layers here. You have a community, you have the relationships of the individuals to the community, and then you have the beliefs and values of the community. Does the narrative support those? The author may be trying to support those, right? Say they're making a movie about Kurt Warner, that film is probably going to reflect American values. You may also have authors who are trying to challenge those and question those narratives and say, is this really an idea we should be ascribing to? And that's, certainly what, say, Hawthorne and Fitzgerald are doing in those examples. If the national identity of America can be characterized as pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, then you could say that the identity of the community in the Scarlet Letter is a Puritan identity, and Hawthorne is challenging some of the values that Puritan society holds, especially when it comes to judgment of people who have sinned according to the community standards. So we call those ideologies. Ideology is a belief system, so to speak, and so you can think of numerous examples probably come to mind. So the belief that anyone can accomplish anything in America is an ideology. And so sometimes you have ideologies that become, they're all floating out there, there's all different ideologies, but sometimes they become not part of the national identity. And so again, authors can subvert those or they can support them in their texts. What's the difference between an ideology and a narrative then? Well, the ideology is the belief, and the narrative is, sometimes it involves a narrative, but a narrative is usually the way the ideology is communicated, or it reveals the ideology to the readers, to the audience members. So, community, individual's relationship to community, that relationship is usually based on the national values and beliefs of the community. Nationalism, I'm using broadly. If you have a small community, there's still going to be ideologies that community adopts and perpetuates. The last theme here is alienation. So, if someone clashes with these values, with the national ideology, that person is usually placed on the periphery of the community, like Hester in the Scarlet Letter. And they're alienated from the community. So they become otherized, which is a term we're going to talk about later in the semester, but they're an outsider, essentially. Now, there are different types of outsiders, because sometimes you have outsiders trying to work their way into the community, which is what Gatsby is really trying to do in The Great Gatsby, and he never really makes it, is what is his undoing there. So you have an insider-outsider dichotomy. Now, sometimes the outsider is someone who's been kind of kicked out of the community, still living on the periphery. Sometimes it's someone trying to force their way, work their way into that community. And typically the reason why this dichotomy is important is you have these national narratives or ideologies, and theoretically everything's functioning properly in the community unless those ideologies are subverted, although that's kind of a myth. And so when outsiders arrive, that disrupts the narrative. It usually throws, an outsider typically never arrives and everything just continues on as it was. That disrupts the social order that is, upheld by the narrative. It's disrupted. Gatsby's an outsider who disrupts the lives of Daisy and Tom and, the narrative they subscribe to about, wealth without concern for the urban poor. So outsiders can often be villains. Gatsby's the hero, but that's because Fitzgerald is challenging things. Oftentimes, though, outsiders are villains. And so the way this all comes back to the topic of the power of fear that we'll go more in depth with next time is, as I said in the course outline, the course description, villains oftentimes represent our fears, or monsters or supernatural elements do as well. So sometimes communities will have a fear that the social order will be disrupted. And depending on what the ideologies are, there may be specific types of fears. And so villains, either because these things have started to happen or there's some inclination they might, or paranoia, and so villains will represent those fears. I think the best example is the films Batman Begins, and then the first Iron Man film from 2008. We'll talk more about these two in later lessons, I think the next lesson, because we'll be talking about fear. But essentially, the villains in these films are terrorists, and they are altered slightly from the comics, the characters are, so that they can resemble terrorists more, because these films were made after 9/11. So it clearly represents, it's clear why terrorists are a societal fear, and why, you didn't see nearly as many villains in films who were terrorists before 9/11. They were other types of villains. So like I said, we'll talk about that more next time. But the way this whole kind of system functions is, first step, identify the community. Second, identify the individuals that are important, the main characters, what their relationship is to the community. Third, what the national narratives or ideologies are that community ascribes to and perpetuates, and how do those beliefs affect the individuals. They kind of determine the individual's relationship to the community based on the individual's attitude toward those issues. And finally, what happens because of the individual's relationship? Are they alienated? Do they become a member of the society? What happens there? So those are the key things to think about in this framework of individual versus community for understanding, how society functions. Because the communities we see in texts are oftentimes reflections of the real, so to speak, communities, secondary world, primary world, the world outside the text. The communities inside the text often reflect and mirror the world outside the text. And so figuring out how the community functions, the values, the individual's relationship, who's alienated or not, who's an insider, who's an outsider, can help us understand the world surrounding the text better. The Iliad and the Ramayana are two works of mythology, two epic poems that focus heavily on the relationship of the individual to the community. They also have some terrifying things in them that can represent fear, but we're going to mostly focus in this lesson, in this discussion board post, on the individual versus community relationship. Again, I'm not going to do an in-depth analysis of either of these two. They're both very long, so we're not reading the whole text of either one. We're just reading two books from the Iliad and one book from the Ramayana. And in epic poems or in long poems, different sections are typically called books rather than chapters. Chapters are a word that came along with the advent of the novel for the main part. But if you're thinking of these like novels because they're long poems with a narrative structure, then these are essentially chapters. So we're looking at two chapters from the Iliad and one from the Ramayana. And so again, I'm not going to do an in-depth analysis. I'm just going to give you the tools, the background, some plot summary of the chapters we don't have, and some kind of background so you fully understand who all these characters are, so that you can then write an in-depth analysis on the discussion board. So the Iliad begins what we call in media res, which means in the middle. The Trojan War has already begun. It's begun because Paris has captured or taken Helen back to Troy with him. She's married to a Greek man named Menelaus, who's a high-ranking officer in the Greek army and a close friend of Agamemnon, the Greek leader. And so they've launched this force to retrieve her from Troy. But you don't get this information until much later on. You're in the middle of the war, actually close to the end of the war when the poem starts. And the initial conflict you see in the first book, I've given you books 1 and book 9, is pretty important, but it's not the central, well, it leads to the central conflict, but it's not the conflict over Helen, which is what people typically think of when they think of the Iliad. So you start in the middle, or actually close to the end in terms of the chronological events. But the first book deals with these two women, Chryses and Brises, who have been captured, essentially. The war has been going on. The Greeks have, captured different places that belong to the Trojans, and when they secure an area they've won in battle, they take prizes, and prizes are often women. You see where I'm going here. So when Achilles wants Brises back in the first book, an important point to make is he's not in love with her, as the 2004 Troy movie with Brad Pitt would lead you to believe. He sees her as a prize, and so it's an issue of pride that she's been taken. Essentially what happens here is Agamemnon has taken Chryses as a prize, and she is the daughter of a religious figure who's close to the god Apollo, and he wants her back. And so when Agamemnon won't give her back, because he's concerned for his daughter, the father prays to Apollo, and Apollo sets a plague on the Greeks, and Agamemnon has to give her back to alleviate the plague. His pride is wounded. Pride is a very important theme here, so he takes Brises from Achilles, who's Achilles' war prize. And so then Achilles is offended, and Achilles' pride is wounded, and that leads to what is the central conflict of the poem, which is the conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles, which has to do with pride. So, essentially what happens is Achilles takes himself out of the fighting because of his pride. He convinces his mother, who's a goddess, and Zeus, the king of the gods, is, say, kind of a thing for... She can convince him of things. She convinces him because Achilles asks her to strengthen the Trojans and help the Trojans fight. And so the Greeks are not doing well, and Achilles is the Greeks' best warrior. So without Achilles, the Greeks aren't going to fare well, especially if the Trojan forces are strengthened by Zeus. And so Achilles does this intentionally. He takes himself out of the fight, and he asks his mother to have Zeus, make the fight go poorly for the Greeks, so that the Greeks will realize just how much they miss him. And this is Achilles' plot. So the theme of pride is probably one of the most important themes in ancient Greek mythology, because it's important in Oedipus as well. One thing you should have in mind. So I've given you some background here. You can clearly see the community is the Greek community. Achilles is the individual. Seems like he's acting mainly in his self-interest here. But there's also a prophecy. We talked about the Achilles heel last time as kind of a signifier. Part of that prophecy is that Achilles will die in the Trojan War. The prophecy is related in other books that I didn't ask you to read, so that's why I'm bringing it in here. So you've got to think about, part of this is certainly pride. He's upset that Brises has been taken from him. It insults his pride. It wounds his pride. But he's also probably thinking about self-preservation, too, because there's a prophecy. So some interesting things happen. In Book 9, there's a long council to try to convince Achilles to go back to war. And so when you're doing your discussion board posts, you only have to write on one of the texts, not both. So if you choose the Iliad, something important to think about might be some of those long passages. You have Odysseus, who is the main character in the Odyssey. He's the primary one talking to Achilles in Book 9. What happens is once the war ends, it takes Odysseus a long time to get home, and that's the plot line of the Odyssey. So you still have he's still a pretty important character here, but not a main character the way Achilles or Agamemnon is. But the thing about Odysseus is not only is he a great warrior, he's a great strategist, he's very intelligent, he's a great orator. So he's really able to talk and communicate with Achilles and make some convincing claims. to get him to come back to battle. And so looking at those passages where in Book 9 where Achilles and Odysseus are talking to each other, and you're trying to answer the question of individual versus community in the Iliad, those might be some great passages to use for your post when you do close reading in your post if you choose the Iliad. The really interesting thing about Book 9, though, is that at this point, because of the way the Trojans have been helped by Zeus and the lack of Achilles on the Greek side, the Greeks are doing so poorly in the war that Agamemnon has conceded to Achilles' pride. The point Achilles wanted to make when he requested Zeus's help has been revealed, and Agamemnon says, you can have Briseis back, you can have all of my women, you can have every woman you want, you can have any city you want, you can basically have everything you want, Achilles, as long as you come back to battle. And Achilles' response is still, no, he's not going to do it. So extreme pride. But it goes beyond just extreme pride. I mean, what is he trying to prove with that point? What is he trying to do? So look closely at the dialogue there, the language there, and think about what Achilles is. I mean, he's been offered anything he wants, and he's still saying no. Why would he do that? Put some more thought to that beyond just he's prideful when you're talking about the relationship of individual and community in the Iliad. Some more kind of plot summary beyond Book 1 and Book 9 you don't have here is that Achilles' closest friend is Patroclus. And eventually what Achilles does is give Patroclus his armor to enter battle and pretend to be Achilles. Because it's not just Achilles as a great warrior, it's also about his reputation. And he's such a great warrior, his reputation precedes him. He thinks that even the idea of him being in battle will affect the ability of the Trojans to fight because they'll be so terrified by him. So he sends in Patroclus wearing his armor. Problem is, Patroclus is killed. Patroclus and Achilles have a strong relationship. I'm sure there are articles out there about, the kind of perhaps homoerotic elements of that, but this is, a different time period, and those elements would mean something very different than either way they have a strong bond, and it has more to do with honor in war and kind of camaraderie than anything else. But Patroclus' death moves Achilles enough to enter battle, not only in spite of his pride, but also in spite of this prophecy. So he knows he'll probably die, and he still goes back into battle that much because of the honor, the relationship to his close friend. And so that's an interesting thing to explore and think about too. Achilles doesn't die in the course of the Iliad, but as I said before, Greek mythology is much bigger than just this text, even though it's the most famous one from Greek mythology, and he eventually does get shot in an arrow, got shot in the ankle by an arrow, or in the heel, by an arrow from Paris. Paris, of course, has the help of Apollo because he's a very weak character. So some themes to think about here. Honor is equivalent to time because of the time you put in with someone. So, or to do the deeds that bring you honor. So that relationship again between Achilles and Patroclus reflects honor. Glory, right? When Achilles sends Patroclus into his armor, he's concerned for a minute that Patroclus will reap his glory, and the prizes, the women, that's kind of part of it. You've won this battle, so there's glory. Wrath is a big theme too. The wrath of Achilles is an important idea here, because Achilles, again, he thinks his presence will be menacing enough that Patroclus can go in with his armor. That's because his wrath is well known throughout the land, and so wrath is also a big theme. Finally, fate. There's a big issue of fate versus free will here. Achilles exerts an enormous amount of will. He gets Agamemnon to bend to what he wants by withholding himself from battle and requesting Zeus's help. So, seems like he has a lot of free will, but there's a prophecy that says he'll die in the war, and then he's still drawn back into the war by Patroclus' death. So, is he really exerting all this free will, or is that all just kind of a sequence of events that occurs, before the prophecy is eventually fulfilled, and can Achilles not really escape his fate? Could he have just gotten on a boat and left after Book 9 instead of hanging out in his tent until Patroclus died, or is he fated to die in the Trojan War? So fate versus free will is also an important theme. The interactions of, it's not listed here, but the interactions of the gods and the mortals is very important too, as it is in all mythology. Apollo fights on the side of the Trojans because Chryses is initially taken as a prize, and Zeus fights on the side of the Greeks because Achilles' mother convinces him to. So those are the two main god figures here, but a bunch of the other gods take different sides and help in the different battles. If you read the whole text, those interactions are quite interesting. So think about Achilles clearly makes selfish choices. What does that say about the individual versus community relationship in the text if you choose to do your discussion board on the Iliad? If you choose to do the discussion board on the Hohner, here's some information to help you here. I've given you a picture rather than a list because there's this nebulous map of characters in the Ramayana. And this picture not only gives you a pronunciation key, but makes it easy to keep track of who is who. So Rama is the protagonist, and his father, Dasaratha, is the king in this city. And it's a culture where polygamy is allowed. So he has 3 wives, and that's perfectly normal in this culture, especially for the king. And so he also has 1 or multiple children with each wife. And so you've got a very interesting, in terms of our topic, a very interesting close-knit community here. And keeping everyone straight is difficult, is why I put the chart up. But it also leads to a very, very interesting individual versus community analysis that I'm hoping you'll look at if you choose this text for your post. So, Kausalya is Rama's mother. Rama's closest friend, who's a soldier named Lakshmana, is the son of Sumitra, who is not a major character. And he has a twin brother named Satrughna, who's also not a major character. But then you have Kaikeyi, who is the mother of Bharata, and she's a very important character. She can almost be considered a villain, depending on how you look at it in this book 2 we have. She's Dasaratha's favorite wife, but Rama is Dasaratha's favorite son, and he's also the eldest, so he's entitled to become king next, both because he's entitled by being the firstborn, and he's the favorite, so he's kind of a shoo-in, so to speak. And the book 2 opens with what is supposed to be his coronation, the ceremony that acknowledges, making it official that he'll succeed Dasaratha. But Kaikeyi is this very manipulative, self-interested character who wants her son Bharata to become king. So she convinces Dasaratha, because she's his favorite wife and has some sway with him, that Bharata should become king. And so instead of it opening with Rama's coronation, they bring Rama in to explain to him, no, you're not going to be king, you actually need to go into exile. And that's what your father wants, Kaikeyi tells him, because she's convinced Dasaratha to go along with this, and she's his favorite. There's a lot more nuance here. I'm trying to summarize it for you guys to help prepare you for the discussion board post. And so it becomes his duty. Rama sees it as his responsibility to honor his father's wishes, to go into exile and not succeed his father as king. As he spreads this news around, or as the news spreads, he has different interactions with the other 3 important characters here, and those are great interactions to look at for how to interpret individual versus community here. 2 important things you should know for when you're looking at those interactions, if you write on this poem, to inform, your response. One is the concept of Dharma, which is an Indian Hindu concept, and there's no real Western translation for it. There's not really an English word that can describe it completely. The closest word I would say would be duty, but that's not exactly it because there's more of a spiritual element than you typically think of with duty. But it entails duties, rights, laws, conduct, virtue, and the phrase that's most often used to describe it is right way of living. Basically, how you should live your life as a Hindu in this culture. And you can immediately probably see the problem with this is it becomes somewhat subjective. So, what is the duty? What is the, anytime you talk about someone's duty, it goes back to that idea of nationalism, right? What are people supposed to do? What is their duty? Are they fulfilling their duty? And the national ideology or national narrative might dictate what that duty is, but other people might disagree, and even then how one fulfills that duty can be somewhat subjective. So that's what you have happen in this book. The other piece of information you need to know is that Rama, as an epic hero, is the avatar of the Hindu god Vishnu, who's the god they worship here and believe in. And his purpose is to demonstrate Dharma. He brings honor to Vishnu by demonstrating Dharma. So just as, Achilles, to say compare, is a much more morally flawed character because of his pride, but he nonetheless represents a lot of Greek ideals and values because he does go along with what the gods want. He does eventually fulfill the prophecy and does eventually die. So even though he's prideful, he still reflects the national narrative of the Greeks that you should, do what the gods say. So even though we in the 21st century would think of Rama as a much more moral character, he still does something similar to Achilles in that the epic is used to explain to the readers, explain to the society how they should live their lives. And Rama is that example because he's willing to give up the kingship, go into exile for 14 years, and leave his family behind, all to honor his father, despite the fact that this manipulative person who's not his mother convinced his father to put this burden upon him. And so that absolute allegiance like that is, what makes Rama the avatar incarnation of Vishnu and the example of how to fulfill your Dharma. What makes it interesting, though, is, again, how you fulfill Dharma is somewhat subjective. So the reason Rama is supposed to be this great example is that he just immediately goes along, with what it is. One of the ideologies here is to honor your parents, and he doesn't even question it. He immediately goes along with it. But then he has interactions with his mother, Kausalya, with Lakshmana, and then with his wife, Sita. And each of these three interactions happen in Book 2 after he receives the news he's supposed to go into exile and not accept the kingship. Each of those interactions, each of those characters makes a different point about how Kaikeyi is manipulating Dasarata, and this is not actually your Dharma, and you need to do something else. And so their points are interesting because they're different rhetorical points. So looking, again, kind of like looking at the conversation between Achilles and Odysseus, looking at each of these conversations can be ways places you look to analyze the text and make an argument about individual and community. So Kausalya tries to convince Rama to stay because she's also his parent, and it would be his Dharma to honor her, and it would make her greatly sad. Even when Rama brings up the point of honoring his father, more so than his mother, because it's patriarchal culture, Kausalya says, if I'm sad, that'll make your father sad. Even though he loves Kaikeyi more, he still loves me too, so you'd be honoring both of us. And Dasarata hasn't thought this through yet. So it's a very important point, but Rama's still not convinced. Lakshmana is more straightforward. He tries to say, Kaikeyi is wrong, you need to fight, you need to resist, the title's rightfully yours. Bharata would not be a good king. It's your duty, your Dharma to the people, to the citizens, to be a good king, that you should be king because you'd be a good king, and so you need to fight and resist and take what's rightfully yours, not because it's rightfully yours, but so that you can be good to the people. The final interaction with his wife Sita is the most interesting. Rama is the epic hero because he reflects the way people should live their lives. He doesn't have He's not part god like Achilles, but he reflects the way people should live their lives, so he's the epic hero. But he's not the most interesting character, because he says yes right away. Sita is an incredibly interesting character, though. This is so far back, and the female characters in the Iliad who are treated as prizes take such a back seat that Sita is one of the most interesting characters, the first really interesting female character we encounter in mythology. And she uses rhetoric too, and the difference between what Sita does and what Kausalya and Lakshmana do is she doesn't try to talk Rama out of going into exile. She convinces him to take her with him, and that's an important point. She doesn't try to convince him his duty is different than what he thinks it is. She convinces him that part of the duty is for her to go with him. And so looking at any of those passages would give you, of those three interactions, would give you plenty to talk about in terms of individual versus community. But, looking at the one with Sita, that conversation would probably be the most interesting for you because she's such a complex, interesting character. So when you do that, it would behoove you to look closely at their conversation and see, the tactics she uses, the rhetoric she uses, how she convinces him. I'd love to go into it here, but, I don't want to do too much. I've probably done too much already. I want to leave that up to you because I'm really looking forward to reading your discussion board posts on this. So again, pick one of these two, either the Iliad or the Ramayana. Focus on the relationship of individual to community, either Achilles to the Greeks or Rama to the Indian Hindu community present at this city here. And remember that when you're analyzing text, this is a framework I'm giving you here because a great way in is to look at the community, the individual's relationship to the community, the national narratives and ideologies and values that impact the individual's relationship to the community, and then how that, what happens there. Is the individual alienated? Are they an insider, an outsider, etc.? And if they're an outsider, does that then reflect fears of the community, which is where we'll go to with the next lecture.